This is Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace. Forgive me for my hairstyle. So, War and Peace. Here, we finally get the War and Peace contrast. If you ever read, or at least seen, the enormity of Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace, you will understand why this is one of the most acclaimed philosophical texts and historical romances that we've ever had in our entire lives. So what do I mean by that? Literally what I just said. It's a historical romance, essentially. People tend to go ahead and believe that it's just a historical romance, in the sense of like the backdrop is the war, the Napoleonic Wars, mainly in 1812, when Napoleon decided that attacking Russia was awesome and should be the next move, instead of like going ahead and attacking Britain. I mean, both moves, attacking Britain and probably attacking Russia, both will eventually lead to Napoleon's downfall either way, except like he realized that he had literally no chance crossing the English Channel, mainly because he didn't have a good enough navy yet. Never will, now that we know that. And the Russians themselves, they were technically their allies, so if they would probably not expect anybody to attack their doorstep, nor were they particularly strong enough to go ahead and get a counter movement at all either way. What do we get in this end? Not much, really. But the War and Peace part, that's the part I really want to focus on. The war, and the peace. The W/P. This is the juicy part of War and Peace. Sure, romance, it's the great part, but that's not the part I'm really interested in. For all those military historians out there, if you're like me, you'll be more focused on how the war part plays out and how people and civilians react towards the peace part. These are two parts I really want to talk about. And then later on, I'll be talking about like a new world order, or NWO. Note that these are probably the only times I've ever used these acronyms, and probably will be the only time I'll ever use these acronyms. I don't make scripts before my videos, so I mix things up as I go ahead and make these videos. I have content though, so that's how I make my videos. Yay me. Anyways, what was I saying? Right, the War and Peace contrast. Let me start with peace, mainly because this is how everything starts. You can't have war without peace, but you can't technically have peace without war, but you have to have a reason for war, whereas you don't really need a reason for peace. Regardless, peace. As the book starts, we have Anna's party, and this is where our peacetime initiative starts. Mostly, though, we're only going to be talking about aristocrats, except that one guy named Platon. That he's a peasant, and he's apparently just supposed to be like the modern day version of Plato, the Greek philosopher that Leo Tolstoy himself was very, very much respected to, and he probably did butcher a little bit of his work into creating Leo Tolstoy into his War and Peace. So we have peace. It's a party, and it's all aristocrats. We only know about the aristocrats, as mentioned earlier. And they go ahead and talk about how war might happen. It's always on the lips of subjects of people's minds nowadays, mainly because this is literally the hottest subject in the entire year. Nobody else is going to be talking about this for centuries to come, until, like, you know, the next war, which might not exactly be centuries to come. Fun fact, after the Napoleonic War, Europe was at relatively a larger amount of peace than it ever was before. It was like, if today was like the most peaceful time compared to the 20th century, then this is like, for them, the early 19th century was like the early 19th century was the most peaceful time in their history ever. Until World War II, but that wouldn't happen until several centuries, or like about a century and a half later. That kind of makes me scared, mainly because it's almost a century. It's almost like a century since World War II ended. It's not close enough yet. It's like 72 years now, but like I'm scared that within my lifetime there will be a world war. Well, at least I hope that by then I'll be too old enough to be conscripted to the military. What was I saying? Right, back to peace. So aristocrats themselves are very ignorant of war, and they always believe war as something that it's kind of flamboyant and enjoying, and it could last really, really short. It could also last really, really long. They know that long wars exist and short wars exist, but they don't really care about war themselves, mainly because they're living in the high status, and that war was for things, you know, the lower people did, until their sons got conscripted into the military, mainly because they wanted to, or they're literally going ahead and getting wartime patriotic mode, or they want to defend the mother Russia. How ignorant and how naive they are, how blissful their minds are, and this, even when war starts, they're still believing they're in peace, mainly because there's no Twitter or X back then, but not an excuse to keep partying, even if you do know that a war is going on, which they eventually do, but they still keep partying, saying that it's not going to happen anyway. Let's enjoy this last night. And this is the perfect transition time to go ahead and talk about how war works. For war, we finally have this idea, in the sense of like, I'm going to talk about military strategies a little bit. Leo Tolstoy himself goes ahead and analyzes war in the sense of, hey, this is going to be an awesome context, this is going to be an awesome place, and that he tries to criticize how historians go ahead and believe that all these wars happen. On the Russian side, people who want to glorify Russia are all like they had this literal strategy where they would go ahead and intentionally lure the French within their borders. Wrong color. Within their borders. And so that when the French actually did come along here, they would actually go ahead and start up their trap, where they would go ahead and trap Napoleon Bonaparte or some high-ranking general, and then go ahead and freeze them to death, like laser security defense systems. In reality, it was the opposite, really. They literally had no plan, and when they realized that the French were coming, the only thing that they just wanted to do was to kick the French out of their borders. Not put them in, they wanted them out. On the French side, they saw Napoleon as someone who had cunning genius and stuff, and thought that it was a great idea, and it probably was, to go ahead and invade Russia, as it was pretty much the only person that could actually threaten its Napoleon Empire, unless you count Britain, but they're like a channel away. So Napoleon did send in troops, and they were very successful, yay! But then, they also like to tend to say that Napoleon did one little tiny miscalculation that went ahead and ruined his campaign. This was the military genius who went ahead and wasn't able to clutch. This same people sometimes even glorify the Russians, saying that they had very good military genius. But but in reality, Napoleon himself just even had advisors to go ahead and tell him that this was a terrible idea, but he never listened to them. In fact, he fired some of them. And he kept on going throughout into the Russian territory. And as a result, he himself was actually very bewildered that his army lost in Russia, and as a result, the retreating of less than 1% of his soldiers surviving as they crossed the border. Incredible, right? So whichever side that these people were on, they would go ahead and have a bunch of these literal thought about how life should work within their communities. First of all, war itself, they always thought the French were all like honor, 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 and then the Russians finally decided that they had enough of this honor system. This was war, this was the 19th century, and that they needed to go ahead and kill the French as their French prisoners. They don't even take prisoners, just as the French did with their own Russian prisoners and fellow brothers and sisters, and liberating those brothers and sisters at the same time when the French actually did capture them as soldiers, prisoners of war, POWs. But Tolstoy himself says that the real reason why the war turned in the tide for the Russians' favor was because of a greater force. That if you did go ahead and compare all these two forces, their deities, you could literally see that the Russian one outshined the French one. In the sense of like, hey, we have a way better place. Also, in my opinion, though, Tolstoy was describing the one biggest ally that has helped and saved the Russian people time and time again. The Russian winter. It gets stupid cold in Russia when it's winter. So it didn't really get that stupid cold in Russia recently compared to like centuries ago. It's probably because of global warming. But that spirit Tolstoy was describing about, I always liked to believe that he was actually talking about the Russian winter. And with this, we have a new world order. And with this new world order, we finally get these aristocrats realizing that maybe their lives weren't exactly all up and shining, that they literally had people to lose. They lost some aristocrats towards the war, and because of their literal mismanaging of their spending during wartime, they literally were in debt. In fact, some of the aristocrats, the children themselves particularly, had a hard time trying to convincing their parents that they had to go live in somewhat version of poverty, even though it's barely poverty. And because their parents, who were aristocrats since they were young and to this very old age, were all used to the great gifts that they had and had access to, these kids decided that they should go ahead and keep this illusion of grand endurement, that they were still rich and still in an aristocratic family type of situation, even though they are literally in heavy big money debts. The only one that I'm arguably going to say is successful at this was Pierre. Pierre was able to do this successfully in the sense like he was able to pay back all of his debts, including some of his relatives and friends' debts, within 3 years. And afterwards, he was able to go ahead and purchase back his family home and stuff, and is able to go ahead and create and get used to this new world order. So his mother is still in this illusion that they're still in the old aristocratic days. And with this new world order, we finally get to see Tolstoy going ahead and putting the final perfection on the character development and the philosophy among his characters. That's all I'm gonna say. So that is my review of Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace. What do I think about this? It's certainly a big heck of a philosophical book, and I really recommend you guys to read it for one sole reason. The fact that it's not just a historical drama, but the fact that it's also an analyzation of history, warfare, love, romances, and how people and their minds work. It's like the Sigmund Freud of Russian literature. In fact, this itself is not exactly that chronological in the sense of like it's a big baggy loose monster, and Tolstoy himself agreed, mainly saying that Western writers have this approach to their writing, whereas the Russian writers had to have a different approach to how they write their stuff. And as a result, we get to finally meet their lives. Leo Tolstoy himself going ahead with War and Peace, and crafting this beautiful heck of a book that in other books can hardly rival, unless you like in length terms. It could Lord of the Rings technically could rival this book, and so could Tales of Earthsea by Ursula K. That hard pronounceable name. And with that, this ends my review of War and Peace. I really hope you guys really did enjoy this episode. It's one of my proudest achievements, reading this whole monstrosity of a book. And as a result of all this, I'm going to say that this was a very satisfying read. Now I gotta find something else to read. So possibly not, if not equally long, just as worthwhile to read. And just as good with that classic smell. So until next time on the Hunter and Sean Show, see you guys soon. Until next time, Shihana, peace. Bye bye!